Yes, we're now live.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the West Basin Municipal Water District Water Policy and Legislation Committee and Special Meeting of the Board of Directors, November 15th. It's now 1:05. Call this committee meeting to order. Is there a quorum, Mr. General Manager?
We'll do a roll call to determine quorum. And we'll start with Director Williams.
Here.
Director Houston.
Here.
Director Deere. Director Alvarez. And Chair Gray.
Here.
Okay, so we do have a quorum and 3 board members present for the special board meeting.
Thank you. Item 3 is public comment. Do we have anyone from the public who wish to comment?
We have no members of the public here in the room today, but I'll look at the platform, and if there's anyone who would like to make a public comment, please let yourself be recognized by raising your hand on the platform. And currently I see no hands raised at the moment. And so therefore we have no public comments being offered today.
Okay, thank you. Item 4, presentations. Are there any presentations?
No, we do not have any presentations for today's meeting.
All right, item 5, action calendar. Any action items?
We have no action items.
All right, item 6, information calendar. Mr. Reed, please proceed.
Okay, and so we have our first information calendar item, and we have Tammy Hurley-High from our Water Policy and Legislation Group to provide a report out on our Greater LA Integrated Regional Water Management Program. So please, Tammy.
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon, Chair Gray and Member Scott Houston and Director Williams. Member, thank you for attending. Good to see you. So this item wanted to bring you an update on the Integrated Regional Water Management Program activities. There's been a lot happening in the past several weeks and months. So I wanted to provide you a quick summary of those activities. And as you are aware, DWR, they have issued a call for projects for the Prop 1 Round 2 IRWIMP implementation grant solicitation. This is available and made to all IRWIMP regions across the state. And so just wanted to provide a little bit of the background on the funding breakdown and how it has been divvied up for this regional area. So first, to describe the funding breakdown, there are 2 separate allocations that include the disadvantaged communities and then the general implementation funding. So $6.37 million is available for the Los Angeles, Ventura, IRWIMP region for disadvantaged communities. And this is divided among 3 regions. And that includes the greater Los Angeles County area. And then it also includes the watershed coalitions of Ventura County and Upper Santa Clara River. So the greater Los Angeles region they basically split this amount, 6.37 million. The greater Los Angeles area received 3.185 million. And then Ventura and Upper Santa Clara River received an allocation of 3.185 million. And they're supposed to divide that in half between those 2 areas. And then there's the general implementation grant project or proposed funding, which is, it includes $17.15 million. And that is allocated across all 5 of the greater Los Angeles County sub-regions. So divide that by 5, each sub-region is allocated $3.43 million. So as a bit of background, the Los Angeles funding area, as I mentioned, includes the Ventura and Upper Santa Clara River. For the disadvantaged community, they received a grant back in 2015 by DWR. And the purpose of that grant is to involve disadvantaged communities and economically distressed areas and the IRWINT planning process. And that program is implemented by a disadvantaged community involvement program task force. And that includes 2 members from each of the 3 regions. So again, the Los Angeles Ventura Disadvantaged Community Funding is $6.37 million. So the Disadvantaged Community Task Force recommended 4 projects to be considered in the application to DWR for disadvantaged community funding. And there's a breakdown included in the memo as far as what those 4 projects are and what they recommended. So there was 1 project in Ventura, 1 project in the Upper Santa Clara region, and there are 2 projects in the greater Los Angeles area, one of them being Healthy Pocket Park at the School, 52nd Street Elementary, and then the other to be water main replacement to improve drinking water quality and fire flow reliability. So moving on, regarding the disadvantaged community implementation funding for the for the greater Los Angeles County disadvantaged community area. Prior to the recommendation from the DACIP task force, the Greater Los Angeles Disadvantaged Community Subcommittee reviewed and evaluated proposals. And the available funding again for the Greater Los Angeles County Disadvantaged Region is $3.43 million. So the Greater Los Angeles County Subcommittee received 7 proposals for disadvantaged community projects with a total funding request of more than $20 million. So that number, the total number of projects obviously exceeded the available grant funds by more than $17 million. So upon review of all of those projects, the Greater Los Angeles Disadvantaged Subcommittee selected 2 projects to be advanced to the Greater Los Angeles Leadership Committee for their consideration to be included on the grant application to DWR. So those 2 projects included the Healthy Pockets Park School project with 52nd Street Elementary, part of the South Bay subregion, and then the water main replacement to improve drinking water quality and fire flow for the Lower San Gabriel and Lower Los Angeles Rivers subregion. So also the Disadvantaged Community Subcommittee recommended 3 projects to be considered for funding from the local subregions for consideration of advancement based on their strong scoring results. And those included, the first one is the Harbor South Bay Water Recycling Project as part of the South Bay subregion. And the second is the Nature Conservancy Bowtie Demonstration Project included in the Upper Los Angeles River subregion. And then the third being the Greater Gateway Water Management Authority Regional Recycled Water Expansion Project as part of the Lower San Gabriel, Lower Los Angeles River subregion. So general implementation funding for the Greater Los Angeles area. Each of the 5 subregions, as I mentioned, are allocated a total amount of $3.43 million. And I'll describe the project presentations for the 2 subregions that include the South Bay and the North Santa Monica Bay subregions, particularly because West Basin has 2 projects that are part of these. So first, for the South Bay subregion, 3 out of the 4 projects were approved to advance to the Greater Los Angeles Leadership Committee. And the members voted unanimously to reduce the budget for the higher scored projects while prioritizing new water supply. So that includes the Van Ness Avenue Wellfield project in the city of Torrance, the Manhattan Beach Coastal Restoration and Resiliency project in the city of Manhattan Beach, and then the Harbor South Bay Water Recycling project, a project of West Basin. So in addition, the South Bay subregion also recommended to submit a project as a backup project to the leadership committee. And this is in case if a project would fall out of the application process. The backup project included a project for Ladera Heights West Centinela Green Improvement Project. And then for the North Santa Monica Bay subregion, the members had voted unanimously to reduce the budgets for each project. And a joint project from Las Virgenes Municipal Water District, West Basin, and Los Angeles County Water Works District 29 scored the highest. So that project would be titled the Outdoor Landscape Conservation Project. It's a partnering program with Las Virgenes Municipal Water District, West Basin, and Los Angeles County Water Works. There are three other projects that they agreed to advance to the leadership committee as well. And regarding the Los Angeles Leadership Committee, their committee is scheduled for tomorrow, Wednesday, November 16th. And the Leadership Committee will consider approval of GLAC Irwin project selection submitted by each of the subregion, including the backup project, and consideration of the GLAC Irwin DAC project selection that were submitted by the EA CIP task force chairs. So everybody that has submitted a proposed project has been asked to give a 5-minute presentation to the leadership committee tomorrow. So that again includes all the projects, the backup projects, everything. So they'll have that 5-minute presentation along with all of the other documents that they've already submitted in accordance with their project proposals. And so the memo also here outlines a description of the eligible projects for this proposed funding under Prop 1 Round 2, a brief description of the Harbor South Bay Water Recycling Project, and then the Drought Resiliency Water Conservation Program. And then lastly, on a different subject but related to IRWIP, is the Prop 1 Round 1 program extension. So back in December 2020, DWR had approved to extend the Proposition 1 IRWIP Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program grant through December 31st of 2022. So the Los Angeles County Flood Control District is the grant administrator for this program to support the IRWIP. And on behalf of the Greater Los Angeles County IRWIP, West Basin serves as fiscal intermediary of the Proposition 1 grant funds for the respective urban regions within the funding area, including retaining contractors and consultants for implementation of the grant program. So during the past several weeks, there have been discussions with the Disadvantaged Community Task Force to seek a time extension for 1 additional year. Right now, we are awaiting a response from DWR. And if they approve to extend this program, we will need to bring this item back to you and to the board for consideration of a time extension of the consultant agreements that are tasked to implement this program. So we will bring more to you next month with the update on that as well. So that concludes this report. I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Are there any questions of Tammy?
Well, Mr. Chair, I do have questions. Not really questions, but a suggestion that, these projects are like all over the place. And I tend to forget what they look like on the ground, where they are on the ground. So I would appreciate having a project location map when we're dealing with these in these meetings, because I kind of grew up producing location maps for projects, for not only for construction, but for like this, for display at meetings. So I have a tendency to want to depend on that. So I'm sure there are other folks out there who are not as tied to the projects like staff is. You know this stuff cold. We have to kind of adjust ourselves to these things as we go. So a map, a location map, not a big fancy thing, but just where's Van Ness? You know, like, for example, you know, just something like that, just because like I say, I don't, we see these every now and then when they come before us, and we have a tendency to forget where they are. That's all. So can we have that, Mr. General Manager?
Absolutely, absolutely, Director. Thank you for that request. Would you like to have a map to accompany this particular discussion? And then going forward, we can include that in future discussions as well.
I think when it goes to the full board for approval, then we should have a location map.
Okay, and I think this will probably be a receive and file item, you know, on the full board agenda, but we can certainly have that as a part of the package.
Still need to see it.
Yeah. Okay, we'll have it for the next board meeting. Okay,
All right, any other questions?
Yeah,
All
this is,
right, thank you.
this is Board
Director
Member
Houston.
Houston.
Yes. Mhm.
Madam Chair, thank you. Real quick, actually no questions, just some great projects. Thank you to the staff that's been working on this. And I guess I would say fingers crossed that some of the ones that apply to West Basin specifically will get approved. But thank you very much.
All right, thank you. All right, can we go to the next item? And thank you very much, Tammy, for that very good report. Thank you.
thank you, Tammy, and thank you, Director, Chair Gray. So our next item is our legislative update for October 2022. And perhaps I could ask our General Manager to provide an introduction for our guests for today.
Yes, thank you very much, Greg. Let me see if I can get my camera on. There we go. Chairman Gray and members of the committee board, it's a great pleasure, obviously, to have guests here with us virtually for update and overview of not just the 2022 state legislative session, but also we just obviously had our statewide elections that do impact the West Basin service area. So we're very lucky to have EML Pappas and Associates here with us today. This includes Emily Pappas and of course Jamie Miner, who are our principals there in Sacramento. There are boots on the ground. They get it done for West Basin time in and time out. So it's exciting to have them here with us today. So I'll just hand it off to you, Emily and Jamie, and thank you for joining us. Emily, you're on mute.
Thanks,
Sorry.
EJ. And we just want to start it off, Jamie and I want to start off with a quick thank you to you, EJ, to our general manager that we really loved meeting a few months back in Sacramento as soon as you all hired him on. And also to Matt, I think we communicate, I would say sometimes on a daily basis, for sure, a weekly basis, and they are keeping us apprised of everything new and going on in the district so that we're able to activate and represent you the best we can in Sacramento. So thanks for that. And the next slide, this is probably somewhat repetitive, but just a reminder, if there are any of you, I don't think any of the directors, but folks new on the call, our firm represents you full-time in Sacramento. We try to participate in all of your association meetings, as well as coalition meetings, and try to do check-ins with most of your legislative delegation offices. And we can talk about that later on. And then we do your legislative kind of monthly reports, do a very frequent call with your staff that we mentioned at the beginning, proactive on strategy when it comes to any issues that the district's having or solutions around funding for projects or interactions with the water board staff or the board members themselves. So the next slide, just thought we would recap it, but you probably have read this in one of the reports, recap kind of what we saw in this current year, but end of year legislative session by the numbers, basically. We ended, the last day of session was August 30th, but technically went into September 1st at 1 a.m., a typical end of night session going to the wee hours of the morning. And in totality, there were 4,476 bills introduced during the legislative session. And then the governor had the month of September through the last day of September signing or vetoing bills. And we did a little comparison, between his administration and Brown's administration. But at the end of those 30 days, the governor had to act. He signed 997 bills from those 4,000 bills introduced at the beginning of the year, and then what got to his desk, and he vetoed 169. So he had about a 14.5% veto rate. And that increased significantly from prior years compared to a 7.9 veto rate in 2011. So when we look back at the Brown administration numbers, Brown's 8 years in office, he vetoed between 10 to 15% of bills. So Newsom's veto rate isn't out of range for what we saw with that past administration. One other thing that we thought was interesting, and always reading the tea leaves, is the governor left the state twice during those months. And when he did so, he went to both Texas and New York for Climate Week. And so that's where you probably started reading a lot of the articles speculating, does he want to run for president? And of course, while he has now said in a few media inquiries since then, that's not his plan. I think that's something that everyone is watching closely, despite his win in the election last week. The other thing, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about what we expect in 2023, are his veto messages. So he was pretty consistent in his veto message with anything that required a cost to the state. He basically cut and pasted and said, with our state facing lower than expected revenues over the first few months of the fiscal year, it's important to remain disciplined when it comes to spending, particularly spending that is outgoing. So he prided himself last year on really funding one-time, not ongoing items. And so we just wanted to flag that, and we'll discuss it later on, because I think it's something, if we're seeing bills that cost money or wanting a piece of legislation that costs money, that's more than one time, I think we're going to probably still have that consistent message coming from his office. So on the next slide, the other theme Jamie and I and our firm picked up on, and you probably read about at the end of session, was keeping the lights on. So during that last month of session, there was a lot of concern coming from the governor's office about not having enough, power out there for facing windy days or days in which the renewables weren't going to provide enough energy. And so while the governor was acting and the legislature was acting on these bills, at the same time, leadership was negotiating budget trailer bills that were follow up to language approved in June, or numbers approved in June. And of that was $15 billion to finance programs primarily relating to water and power. So I think that's it. Diablo, as you all saw, was the nuclear energy facility that the legislature voted to possibly extend if needed. And those discussions will not related to water. I think it's just important to understand that it's probably going to take some more air out of the room as we go into the new session, so much so that they already had another informational hearing on it yesterday. So I'm going to hand it over to Jamie. We're going to toggle back and forth through the remainder of the slides to talk about some of the bills that we and the associations worked on that were of impact, and go from there.
Yeah, thanks. And then if you don't mind switching to the next slide. So we'll start with some of the bills that we as in West Basin and your team actively supported. So that meant testifying in committees, doing support letters, writing to the governor when it got to his desk, and actively working within a coalition. The first of which, SB 230 by Senator Portantino. This sets up a Constituents of Emerging Concern program over at the Water Board. It was sponsored by NET, or by Metropolitan. Instead of kind of these one-offs as these constituents emerge, the idea behind it is we have a program at the Water Board that will give some direction, some clarity on how to comply for drinking water providers. So that was successfully passed and signed by the governor. AB 2142, which is a turf tax return bill. So this allows any sort of turf conversion to not be taxed as taxable income. This overcame some great opposition from the teachers union, just given the ongoing pressures of the general fund, and did ultimately pass and was signed by the governor. West Basin was, an early leader on this issue. Just given how important some of the outdoor use, the conversation is, and turf removal and the programs you guys have already launched. So we were happy to see that was ultimately signed by the governor, despite the fiscal times that Emily noted. AB 1845, this is a pretty technical bill that was also sponsored by MET, but with that West Basin supported. It allows MET to use design build and progressive design build construction and manager and general contractor projects for delivery methods. For a regional water recycling project. And then AB 2449 by Assemblywoman Rubio. This allows for a little more flexibility for legislative bodies and local agencies to use teleconferencing without identifying each location, the noticing and the agenda of the meeting. It was originally introduced as a much broader effort, but saw some opposition from local governments and was ultimately signed as a much narrow version, just giving, again, that flexibility. And then we also supported AB 1655, which, as you know, set a state holiday for Juneteenth. This was signed, but with a signing message that the governor just wants the legislature to look more holistically as they put forward these state holidays in the future, because he's just seeing a lot come to his desk year after year. As far as the bills that were stopped, and these were, West Basin did not take official positions on these, but our associations did. So they took up a lot of the air in the room just around water policy conversations. So are worth noting, starting with SB 222, this is probably, sounds familiar. It sets up a low income residential ratepayer system or program. Industry had ongoing concerns with the rollout of how the program worked at the local level, the data that would need to be gathered for it to be successful, and kind of the burden that placed on some of the local agencies. It was vetoed by the governor. He said that there was no funding source for such a program, so why prop up a program that won't get funded ultimately? And then 2201, which limited some of the abilities for groundwater sustainability agencies to approve wells in certain regions, especially where there were, heavily overdrafted basins. This bill was vetoed by this bill was it didn't pass the final Senate vote because the governor kind of sent the signal that he would veto it if it did get to his desk. So they didn't end up sending it his way. And then SB 1124, this was a bill sponsored by Central Basin, which just looked at one constituent, manganese, and set up a new program at the Water Board. And the industry had concerns because instead of this one-off approach, they wanted a more holistic program for these constituents. So that's why many supported SB 230. So that's a glimpse just at some of the major bills that we saw and engaged on this year. Don't mind going to the next slide. Thought we take one additional moment to discuss one of the hotter bills from section SB 1157 by Senator Hertzberg. You'll recall a few years ago, a bill package made its way through the legislature, the Making Conservation a Way of Life framework. This was in 2018, and it mandated the Water Board to recommend to the legislature indoor residential water use efficiency standards, in addition to other standards. So the Water Board came out with a recommended metric last summer, and then SB 1157 was introduced to codify that standard. So the new standard within the bill is 55 gallons per capita daily. Moving from that to 47 by 2025, and then 42 by 2030. So upon introduction, pretty much all of our associations opposed, had concerns. It was just a blanket, a blanket standard with no sort of variance or consideration for flexibility. Some push for amendments to allow for flexibility, whether it's on impacts to the wastewater stream, to water recycling collection, affordability, a lot of just considerations. Amendments were put into the bill when it got to the second house that allowed for some of that flexibility, a variance process, studies. So we saw some of our associations remove their opposition, including water reuse. CMUA did as well, and the sanitation agencies. Aqua did remain opposed to the end, just given kind of the diversity of opinions on the issue. They couldn't quite get to a neutral position despite it moving in a better direction. It barely passed the assembly. Once it got there, the administration had to get involved and did say that they would give some sort of direction if it were to be signed on water recycling and the importance of it. And that ultimately happened when it was signed by the governor, giving a nod to water recycling, that the Water Board should absolutely look at variances for those impacts, just given the investments these local agencies need to make in these systems. So we move on to the next slide. These are some of the other standards that are coming our way. Again, that legislation that passed in 2018, the conservation framework, It mandates the water board and DWR to come up with a number of different recommendations. So you'll see some of them here, including an outdoor residential use one, the CII use one, variances for unique uses, standards for outdoor irrigation of landscape areas, and then methodologies for the water board to calculate urban water use objectives. So the next steps, all of those have been, they've had pretty, over the past few years, pretty robust stakeholder groups, working groups to develop those standards and make sure they're based in fact. They were put forward in September. And so now it goes to the board just for more discussion. It actually is before the board today as an informational item. So there'll be an opportunity for public comments that our associations are working on. And folks are just kind of, trying to figure out what it all means. And then in 2023 and then going into 2025 is really when the enforcement starts. So when they have to submit their urban water use objectives and when the water board can take action based on how they're able to achieve those. And then 2025, they can get much more aggressive, and then 2027 start issuing violations if agencies do not meet what's laid out in those standards or in those water use objective reports. Next slide. As far as the budget bill, Emily referenced, there was a huge, climate budget effort, 3.6 billion of which was for immediate drought support and long-term water resilience. Won't go over all of what was included in it for water, but just some highlights for you. 100 million for water recycling projects. West Basin, we worked with our legislators and delegation to get them to sign on to a letter to submit to the entire legislature, the budget chairs, the administration, asking for funding for water recycling. So we were really excited to see that included, and actually a much higher amount than most all the other infrastructure or drought infrastructure efforts and buckets. There's also 100 million for PFAS support. 75 million for turf replacement. So we're starting to see that money and that program get out the door. And then 400 million for the water board's share of the state revolving fund. So that, can fund a number of different projects of all different levels. So that's just a glimpse of what's in the budget. And then I'll pass it back to Emily to give you an update on your election and what it means for your delegation.
Great. So as we somewhat talked about on the top of the call, with the elections last week, and then or if someone can switch over to the next slide, if that's helpful. But with the election last week, and we've been waiting on this for, a few years now, knowing that we were going to have a significant influx of new members. And we talk about that a little later on as we talk about what we expect in 2023. But for West Basin specifically, here is your new delegation on the assembly side. Some of these faces, obviously, actually, you probably know all of them even locally, so all their faces look familiar. But for our perspective, while 3 of these members here have already been up in Sacramento, and of course, Assemblyman McKinnon a little bit towards the end of the year, 1 or 2 of them relatively new to us in Sacramento. So again, I think we will be working with your general manager and your assistant general manager and staff on thinking through, does it make sense for you all to come up here and obviously continue your relationship building with them locally, but then having you up, since we have such a robust new delegation, up to Sacramento and to remind them of, what our focus and priorities are for the district. So going to the next slide, here is your Senate delegation. 2 of the members obviously have been up in Sacramento for several years now, and one of the senators will be a new face in Sacramento. So they will all be up here on December 5th for swearing in, usually spending time with their families. The assembly will be voting for their new leader, and then they will head home until the first week of January. We finally got the updated legislative calendars last week for 2023, and they will be returning in Sacramento officially on January 4th to start the 2023 legislative session. So going to the next slide and just kind of reiterate a few of the points we made, what can we expect for 2023? So I think the key thematic here is this budget downturn, somewhat what we talked about when we talked about what the governor's veto messages were. Our LAO, the Legislative Analyst Office, said the outlook for 2022, 2023 basically is not looking good. Their estimates suggest that the collection from our state's three big tax pots, personal income, sales, and corporate tax, are most likely not, or are more than likely not to fall below prior projections by at least 5 billion. So while we still hope for a lot of these investments to be made in drought infrastructure needs and water, I think it's just something for us to be cognizant of as other pieces of the budget, have to constitutionally be funded. We can also expect this year at least 40, we can expect several new legislators, as we've talked about, and the Democrats picking up at least one Senate seat to maintain the supermajority. And then over in the Assembly side, there could be even more pickups. So just last week, which was 2 days after the election, the Assembly Democratic Caucus met on Thursday, and there was a 6-hour closed-door discussion at the Convention Center about does leadership change. And you'll recall we probably presented to you last year, there was an attempt by colleagues in the Democratic Caucus and the Assembly side to replace current Speaker Assemblymember Anthony Rendon, and despite those efforts, he still remained leadership. So the caucus, though several members were absent, not in Sacramento that day, and several people's elections hadn't been, called yet, they still met on Thursday. And after the 6-hour discussion, there was an agreement coming out of that when they come to Sacramento on the 5th, they will vote for a transition plan with current Assembly Speaker Rendon remaining Speaker until June 30th. And then at that time, Assemblymember Rivas replacing him as Speaker. Obviously, there's still even speculation around does that happen, especially since some of the members were absent with that discussion last week. So it will make for an interesting year, and an interesting year as far as changes in new committee chairs and members. Typically, or because we have so many new members coming in and because we had some members leave, including chairmanship for Assemblymember Quirk of Environmental Safety and Toxic Material Committee, we will naturally see new committee chairs. And some of these new electeds will also need to sit on committees. So we'll see some shuffling around. But we've been told is that a lot of the chairs will stay the same, and then maybe when the new leadership comes in, some of those will change. So something to be aware of, and we'll watch for, especially when it comes to the committees that are of impact to bills that we care about for the district. So I'm going to turn over to Jamie to talk about a few more things before we conclude.
Okay, next slide. So as you'll recall, in August, the governor proposed his water supply strategy, which really, just laid out his vision for adapting to a future with at least 10% less usable water over the next 2 decades because of climate change. So once it was released, it was great. West Basin CM Reed was able to give a quote in response. It was highlighted in some of the press coverage about the report and the strategy and just next steps and what that means. High level, it includes an $8 billion strategy with 4 main goals. First of which is to create storage. Second is to recycle and reuse 800,000 acre feet of wastewater per year. Third, to employ more efficient water conservation techniques. And then 4, to desalinate more seawater and brackish water. It also focused a bit on environmental regulations and the permitting process and how it just it really prevents projects from getting built. One of the principles of the plan is to change permitting to address regulatory thickets to fast track these projects and move things forward. That was the quote from from Governor Newsom. So we can really expect next year the governor and the administration to lean aggressively into this strategy. We'll probably see highlights of it within the January budget as far as a funding approach. But also, we can expect to see maybe either through budget trailer bills or through policy bills, things pushing, on the permitting front, on the kind of regulatory red tape front. The reaction was mixed as far as, industry, they applauded the efforts, but also think that they might not go far enough. So you see, the advocates for desal or even water recycling saying, these are great metrics, but also we can meet those pretty quickly. They don't need to be so far off. They could be a little bit more aggressive. The NGO's reaction was, it really didn't take into account the water needs for the environment and habitats. They felt that it did not focus on agriculture water use enough, just given, obviously agriculture use is a major, water source throughout the state. So, it was mixed, but he had to do something on the issue, and this was his strategy. And it's something we can, we'll talk about a little bit later on how we use it to build our own strategy and set ourselves up for success next year. Next slide. So with this, new re-election from the governor, nobody expected that to change, but we're likely to see a lot of turnover, a lot of new faces that this new, his re-election will bring. Starts at the top with his executive secretary. So Jim DeBoo, who has been in that position since for a few years at least, he will be replaced by Dana Williamson. She came from Governor Brown's administration. She's been doing some ballot initiative consulting, some consulting for PG&E over the past few years in the private sector. So she will be his new top aide as executive secretary. And then Ana Montesantos, she, you might recall her name bubbling up when talking about the PG&E bankruptcy, energy reliability. And she also was the lead negotiator for the administration on the voluntary agreements on the Bay Delta and with the State Water Project. So she's been replaced by Ann Patterson, who was also point on a lot of the energy issues, the PG&E wildfire issues that we saw a few years ago. And then in the environmental space, we've seen quite a few changes as well within the cabinet and at the agency level. So former Cal EPA Secretary Jared Blumenfeld has stepped down. He is taking a job with a nonprofit headed up by Laureen Powell Jobs, his climate fund. And then Yana Garcia, she was tapped as the new secretary overseeing Cal EPA. You'll recall the water board is under Cal EPA. She comes from the AG's office and led on environmental justice efforts with a focus mostly on disadvantaged community advocacy, just to give you a sense of her background. And then, as many of you are aware and probably familiar with, former LA Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa was also appointed shortly after the water supply strategy was released. His role is really to serve as an advisor to the state of California, not an employee of the state of California, but an advisor. And he is tasked with working with local, state, federal leaders to identify priority projects and just bring in funding to the state from the federal level. And then as far as the water board staff, we've seen a bit of commotion and turnover. You might have read an LA Times article where Max Domberg, who is the lead pretty much on conservation and drought efforts at the water board, has stepped down, and then he left this memo that caused quite the commotion, saying that the administration was not aggressive enough when it comes to conservation, and then also cracking down on agricultural water use, and spoke very poorly of the VAs and the VA process. So it did cause quite a bit of controversy, but they have not backfilled his position quite yet. But he really was a leader when it came to implementing the conservation framework that I spoke about earlier. The next slide, just as far as what we can see for next year specific to water use. Sorry, any questions? Okay. As far as what we can see next year and just themes, starting with how much rain we get over the winter. We could see if we have a pretty dry winter like we did last year, additional curtailments on watersheds throughout the state and the Delta especially. Obviously allocations be much lower or at zero like we have seen in years prior. But instead of a kind of voluntary curtailment, making them much more mandatory and maybe even long term. And then, of course, we've seen a voluntary call for conservation to date. That could absolutely change if we see another dry winter and level up to a more mandatory conservation effort. The governor has been pretty reluctant to do that so far, but given he just was reelected, overwhelmingly, and we haven't made a lot of progress, at least across the board. Most regions, especially with West Basin's region, has been pretty successful when it comes to conservation, but that's not the state as a whole. So we could see that ratchet up. And then water rights enforcement. This has been a controversial issue that we've heard about, especially in the media over the past few weeks. There was an article that outlined some of the reactions in the Shasta watershed when it came to curtailment, and some of the water right holders up there just ignoring that. So, that speaks to, well, is the penalty not high enough? How do they thwart some of this action when, folks aren't listening to these mandates and orders. And then water affordability, mentioned a bill that was vetoed last year, or this session, SB 2222. We have already heard the authors and sponsors want to come back up or come back with a piece of legislation on water affordability in a program. The question is, okay, well, how's that going to be funded, especially in a budget down year? This would be an ongoing program. It's not a one-off. So do they look at other revenue sources like, water rates or other ways that they can raise that and fund such a program? Utility shutoff restrictions. We saw a notice from the AG that there were some actors that didn't quite follow some of the guidelines during the moratorium during the COVID period, and also some that were not eligible or captured in that. So there was mention of maybe expanding that, especially to smaller entities, that they cannot have shutoffs in times of, downturn, or you have another public health emergency like COVID. And then Brown Act updates, the state of emergency that gave a lot of flexibility for local agencies is set to be lifted in February of 2023, pending nothing happening this winter. So what does that mean as far as how agencies, do they have to get back to normal with Brown Act procedures, or will there be some flexibility? We've heard that there might be some action taken, especially as state agencies have embraced this kind of more remote model. And if the state's doing it, then locals probably will have to be given that same flexibility. So it will be an ongoing conversation of what that means as far as long-term and kind of just updating some of these requirements for local government. Then I will pass it back to Emily on our specific advocacy for next year.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. So just somewhat in conclusion, as we've now heard what the legislative themes and policy direction is for next year, how do we translate that to how we advocate for you in Sacramento? And so I think the first thing we've talked a little bit about, internally is maybe doing and having several of you directors up to Sacramento earlier on in the year to do, kind of intro. But again, I know you probably know all the electeds, but just kind of meet and greet, check-in meetings with our legislative delegation in Sacramento, those that have been here and then those that are newer. And while we won't know all the bills introduced, if we do it earlier in the year at that point, we think it's fine because it could serve as a reminder of what our priorities are within the district and that we're here as a resource. And if they have any bills that they're working on, that you could provide your thoughts on them. And then, of course, as we see legislation and we need to loop back with them in the year, that relationship has already been started. I think the other thing we should think about going into the year is cultivating some of these members to be water policy champions. And a way you could do that is in talking points at a lobby day could be, hey, as committee changes perhaps possibly get moved around and people are getting put on committees, especially to our newer electeds, would be, do you have an interest in water? And if so, would you be, are you interested in asking leadership to be put on water committee? So those are some of the things we can incorporate into a lobby day. And then as Jamie touched upon in her slide, kind of dusting off what the governor came out with in his administration's water supply strategy, looking through that, and we can help do that with you, identifying what of his recommendations we have an interest in or would like, and try to back channeling that with, letting the governor's office know that we're here to support or be helpful with those, those pieces of his strategy that we have an alignment with. And then, of course, continuing to work with coalitions to support proactive drought policy. We will continue to look for those opportunities, and then continue to be with, work on association policy working groups, which, as your staff, already is actively involved with, but continuing to do that. And then I think on our final slide, other than just the conclusion slide, is so defining after we define what our priorities are for on the policy side, just to recap what the administration's focus is, and the continued work on voluntary agreements, conservation turf removal, supportive permitting streamline, look at storage and increasing capacity. And then as far as funding goes, if working with the district on what rises to the top of what our priorities are for project and what projects we have in the pipeline, as we've talked to your staff about in the past, so that as funding from this last budget or future budgets does happen, despite the budget constraints, we can help maybe offer, setting up meetings with State Water Board staff to see, how they are doing some of those funding opportunities. building coalitions early, leaning into the themes, again, as to what the legislature or the governor's office is focusing on, signing on to coalition letters as we did the last few years, and again, meeting and educating our elected officials. So with that, we will just turn to the kind of conclusion side and open up for questions. And again, thanks again for giving us the honor of representing you and for letting us talk for a long time during this presentation.
All right. Thank you, ladies. Thank you so much for the presentation. I believe that you've concluded. So are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, Madam Chair, this is Director Houston.
Yes, please.
Excellent. Thank you. And I want to just say thanks to, of course, Emily and Jamie for a very comprehensive presentation, but also representing us so well up in Sacramento. I just want to say thanks again for your service to the agency and to the board. And a couple of things I just wanted to note. One is I'm really looking forward to this new class coming in. As you said, most of us know these new members. As a matter of fact, Rick Zabur, who just declared his victory today, he's a good friend of mine. So I think Division 4 has the most new members across both houses. So I'm going to be anxious to meeting some new people that we're working with. And I like your idea of identifying some folks that if we could suggest to them or try and identify them about their interest in water and how they could be an advocate for us, because I would love to work with some of our local members on bills that we can support them with, or maybe that we're pushing and they can help us with. So I love that suggestion, ladies. I do think in the big picture, there's so much change. So I just think it's really exciting right now. It's going on up in Sacramento. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it's good that, where the governor seems to be heading, but also having some new folks in place. This is a great time for us to make new relationships and hopefully move some things forward. On behalf of the district. I wanted to say two items that you brought up, and I think one of those is the earlier visit. I do think that's a great idea, and so I'm not sure what you all are thinking yet, but it seems to me, February would probably be a good month to hopefully go up. I don't know if that's too soon or too late. Otherwise, maybe March, but it seems that time frame would be ideal. So February or March, I'd love to hear your input on that. And then the other thing I wanted to say, and this is probably both to you all and our staff, is we need to come up with what are West Basin's sort of legislative priorities, if there's something that is put together and brought back to this committee in the next 1 to 2 months, so that when we are sitting down as a group, the board can understand what staff is suggesting and kind of help massage that roster. So those are my two suggestions. So I guess my question then on that would be, what do you all think about coming up in February or March? What may be ideal? I think January might be a little too quick, probably even for us, but even with the legislature getting started and staff, et cetera, but what do you all think about my thoughts?
Yeah. Thanks, Director Houston. And I think that time frame is totally fine. Initially, we were thinking that very last week in January / first week in February. But if that's too soon, that's fine. We were looking at some weeks in February, and President's Day means they get busier with session. And so there were little dates in there, but we can make February work too. March, quite frankly, we can work also. The only kind of general issue with that, but we worked around it last time, is policy committees, will start happening before they head out on spring recess for a week on the 30th. So the only issue with that is, members may get pulled away and have to be in policy committees. But again, we've worked on in the past, and they will always find a way usually to step out because you are all electeds and they, respect you all and want to have the FaceTime with you. So we will work with, your general manager, EJ, and with Matt on trying to find dates that work best for all of you that have an interest in coming up to Sacramento.
Okay, excellent. Well, I definitely defer to your expertise. So if it's late January, that's great with me, or into February, but whatever's ideal to get in front of their faces before they get extremely busy, and maybe even before some of the bills are starting to be developed. So I know you'll work with our staff, and I would ask our staff too to obviously pull the board members to make sure that we're available, because I for sure want to go up there. It's been, what, 2 or 3 years since we've had an opportunity to do this, and we have new members. So it's extremely important to start building those new relationships with them. And so I will do my best to make my calendar available. So with that, I thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to, Emily and Jamie so much for your service to West Basin. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Houston.
All right, any other comments or questions? Well, Jamie and Emily, I'm very sorry that I'm not there, or we're not in person. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Did
we can
someone
hear
else-
you, and not a problem at all. It's just fun getting to talk to all of you.
Right, it's great to listen to your report this morning. I agree with Director Houston, and I'm sure that all of us do agree that it was very thorough. Look forward to getting together in person. I know there was a thought of both you ladies coming down and the board getting together with you, and that did not happen. I don't know if there's still something we can do, but we do need to talk about our day in Sacramento, and we do need to have the rest of the board to be a part of that discussion. So, Mr. General Manager, I suggest you put that on the calendar for us to discuss that with input from your lobbyists, and you can tell us what that input is, and we can make a decision about what time frame we want to go up there. But I think the full board needs to weigh in on it. So I think we need to start talking about that. So at the next meeting, maybe that can be part of the agenda.
Okay, we'll do Director Gray. And just to clarify, are we interested in having that conversation in the next full board meeting scheduled for the end of this month? Or do we want to kind of queue that up for the next water policy meeting a month from now?
I think the next water policy meeting, that'll give you a chance to get input from Emily and Jamie. And then when we discuss it in committee, we can have a discussion there, and then it can be on the agenda, or whatever the direction is. It doesn't have to be a board action, but we do need to discuss it. So I think that's good enough to discuss it in committee meeting next month.
Okay,
Right.
understood. So we'll bring that forward in the next water policy meeting.
Okay. All right. Again, thank you for that very comprehensive report. Look forward to seeing all of you, both of you in person and going to Sacramento. But again, thank you. Your firm has been outstanding in terms of providing us guidance in our efforts with the state. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
All right.
And I'll also add my own thank you to Jamie and Emily for their very thorough report. And, we were hoping to have you here with us in person today. But because of availability, limited availability, we thank you for your flexibility in adapting and being here online with us today. And we look forward to continued collaboration and discussion for our next steps, going into the next legislative section. But thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank
So,
you. Consider
Director-
the next item, please.
Okay, fantastic. So that brings us to our federal update, and that's going to be provided by Matthew Vey. So Matt, please take her away.
Thank you, Greg, and good afternoon, committee and board members. The federal affairs report starts on page 12 of the packet. And so in what was previously or recently expected to be a pretty significant change to the congressional makeup as a result of the midterm elections, with Republicans projected to take control of both the Senate and the House, it now appears that a less dramatic shift will occur. At this time, the Democrats will maintain a small majority in the Senate. They're currently running at a 50 to 49 state seat lead at this time, with the state of Georgia that still has to head off to a runoff on December 6th. So even if the Republicans were to take the Georgia election, the Democrats would own the tiebreaker as a result of having Vice President Kamala Harris serve as the tiebreaker. In the House, however, Republicans appear to be, as of today, on the cusp of winning a small majority over the Democrats. However, there are a number of close races that are yet to be called, including some in California, which could change the final balance of power there in the House. More than likely, the Republicans will end up with probably in the neighborhood of a 3-seat majority, give or take, when it's all said and done. So really, what does that mean going forward? I think either way, it's not expected that either party will enjoy anything other than a small majority, and will really have to rely on bipartisan relationships to move forward legislative priorities over the next couple of years. This will make moving anything big policy-wise somewhat of a challenge for the Biden administration. However, they were able to get through the infrastructure package and the Inflation Reduction Act over the last year. So there is some precedent there in finding some bipartisan participation. In the West Basin service area, all of the local House of Representatives delegation won their re-election bids, with Brad Sherman, who will represent a portion of the district in the Malibu and Topanga area, and Sydney Comlager replacing Karen Bass in her newly drawn district, also winning election to serve portions of the West within the West Basin footprint. And then I also wanted to mention just a couple of breaking news items, although one of them is not all that unexpected. One, it's looking like former President Trump is going to announce his 2024 presidential run later today, which will make the next couple of years very interesting, to say the least. And second, the Republicans voted to nominate Kevin McCarthy as the next Speaker of the House, assuming that the Republicans do achieve the needed majority there. McCarthy is a lawmaker from Bakersfield area, which means that California would continue to keep the Speaker position within the state boundaries, as current Speaker Nancy Pelosi has served as Speaker for the last few years. We're planning to have the district's federal lobbyist, Van Scoyoc and Associates, in attendance at next month's Water Policy and Ledge Committee to provide a full recap of the federal election results and to highlight a number of other important federal topics of interest. Moving on to some other issues. Late last month, the Department of the Interior and the United States Bureau of Reclamation announced that they would be implementing new environmental reviews of the operating guidelines of the Hoover and Glen Canyon dams, which could lead to future changes in how much water is both stored and allowed to flow downstream of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, which would have an effect on California's access to Colorado River supplies. The 7 Colorado River Basin states have yet to reach consensus on how to reduce water use by 2 to 4 million acre feet over the next couple of years, which has led the government to consider more aggressive actions that would protect conditions on the Colorado River in order to both ensure adequate water supplies and to ensure power generation capabilities there. The feds are considering 3 alternatives, including unilateral action by the Secretary of the Interior to enact mandatory limits on water use by any or all of the Colorado River users. So again, this continues to be something that everybody's tracking very closely, and it looks like there's going to be, additional action taken in the coming months. I also wanted to touch on PFAS, which is the classification of forever chemicals. That's been a environmental and water quality issue for the state of California and the nation. Continues to be a hot button issue with coalition groups made up of municipalities and water agencies that have been working together to provide comments on the EPA's proposal to designate PFAS as a hazardous substance. West Basin and our federal lobbyists continue to be engaged on this issue, and we're continuing to look for opportunities to partner with other industry leaders to ensure that any potential impacts on our local communities and on our district itself are minimized. Members of the legislature, including Senator Dianne Feinstein, have called on the US EPA to increase efforts to regulate PFAS pollution in the nation's communities. including requiring PFAS producers to monitor and report PFAS discharges. There was also recent legal action taken by California's Attorney General Rob Bonta to sue manufacturers of PFAS chemicals, which really shows that both the state and the federal entities are making this a priority going forward. Finally, we are starting to plan and look at potential dates for a Washington, D.C. lobbying trip next spring. Staff is developing an updated briefing book to bring with us to any elected official and or agency meetings that we would hold next year in either the state capitol or in the nation's capital. So once we have a better idea of timing, staff will work with the general manager to gauge interest and to coordinate availability of the directors to do a DC trip next year so that we can start reaching out to our delegation offices and to agency staff early next year. So we'll follow somewhat of a similar process for our federal trip next year as well. And again, just to mention it one more time, we do plan to have our federal lobbyist VSA join us in person at next month's water policy meeting on December 15th. So really hope that you could put this on your calendars as we expect really good presentation and discussion from Pete and Jeff. So that concludes my federal report. Additional information is available for review in the monthly report in the agenda packet. Please let me know if you have any questions.
All right, thank you, Matt. Are there any questions?
Yeah, this is Board Member Houston.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As a matter of fact, I'm glad you brought that up, Matt, because I noticed you mentioned it. So December 15th actually is CRUA in Las Vegas. And at this point, I'm planning to be in Las Vegas, and I assume probably another director or two. I would suggest if there's a way, do you guys reschedule the Water Policy and Legislative Committee meeting? Or worst case scenario, have them just Zoom in because one of us is not going to be there physically and maybe more. So I think that you all need to look at that calendar and figure that out. Otherwise, I will not be in attendance. And then the other thing is, Madam Chair, I agree that we need to start planning for the trip to DC. So I think just as you suggested, they talk about that next month at this meeting. They should also start talking seriously about dates next month for looking at DC. And I'm assuming that would probably be in the February-March timeframe. And so with that, that's all I got. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other comments, questions? All right. Thank you for bringing that up, Director Houston. I think that's a good idea. And so, Greg, would you add that to the agenda to discuss our trip to DC, a federal legislative trip to DC with the board, in addition to Sacramento?
Yes, we will do that, Director Gray. Thank you for that, and thank you, Director Houston. And Director Gray, just following up on Director Houston's suggestion with this particular committee meeting scheduled for December 15th, and the possibility of either attending virtually or rescheduling so that it does not overlap with the Colorado River Users Association meeting conference. Would you care to provide any further direction along those lines?
Yes, I was going to tell you that I will be in touch with the board secretary to give us some other dates. We will reschedule it. Okay.
Thank you for that.
All right. Sure. Anything else to follow up on? All right. Next item, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So that brings us to item C, which is our Metropolitan Water District updates. And we have Tammy Hurley-High again to provide that report. So thank you, Tammy.
Thank you, Greg. Hello again. So I want to provide an update on activities happening at the Metropolitan Water District that may be of interest to West Basin. And so this information starts on page 17 of the committee packet. First, the Delta conveyance. As you are aware, DWR has released a public draft environmental impact report back in July for the Delta Conveyance Project. And DWR has announced that the comment period has been extended to Friday, December 16th, 2022. And there have been some formatting and editorial updates that were identified in the draft environmental impact report, which prompted a changed sheet to be prepared. And none of the identified changes would modify the draft environmental impact report analysis or conclusions. Also, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers preparing an environmental impact statement, which will be planned to be released in a draft form for public review later this year. And a copy of these documents is included on the Delta Conveyance Project website. And there is a link to their website included in the board report. And then next is the project labor agreement for construction contracts. So the Metropolitan Board authorized project labor agreements with several trade councils throughout all 5 counties that are serviced by Metropolitan. And historically, Metropolitan has successfully implemented project labor agreements for projects that have included Diamond Valley Lake, the Inland Feeder, and Skinner Plant Improvement Program. This was back in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. So moving forward, Metropolitan's construction projects will be implemented over the next 5 years. Those will be covered by a collective bargaining agreement with labor unions and construction contractors. Projects covered by the project labor agreements will constitute over 90% of Metropolitan's planned capital investment plan construction contract expenditures over a 5-year pilot phase, while also providing opportunities for the small contractors that typically bid on less complex construction contracts. And then next item is a resolution calling for banning non-functional turf. The Metropolitan Board adopted a resolution recommending a call for cities and water agencies to pass ordinances to permanently prohibit the installation and irrigation of non-functional turf. The call is largely directed at both existing and new commercial, industrial, and public properties, as well as homeowner association rather than individual residential properties. And as you may recall, last November, Metropolitan declared a regional drought emergency due to severe and persistent drought conditions. And then a few months later, in April 2022, Metropolitan adopted an emergency water conservation program to address the supply shortages in the state water project dependent areas. So looking ahead and planning for supplies next year, of equal concern are the conditions along the Colorado River. So this resolution includes language that could be copied and inserted into a city's water conservation ordinance. And of course, details would depend on the nature and scope of the municipal authority. And the language in the resolution is crafted to provide a basic framework that includes prohibit irrigation of non-functional turf with potable water after the effective date of the ordinance with certain exceptions. Prohibit installation of non-functional turf after the effective date of the ordinance with certain exceptions, and then require the removal of all non-functional turf from commercial, industrial, or public properties or facilities by a certain date. So the language provides a placeholders for municipalities and cities to insert their preferred enforcement methods and timelines. And a copy of the resolution can be found on Metropolitan's website. And there is a link provided here in the memo as well that can show you what that resolution and how it reads. So next, regarding the water surplus and drought management update. Metropolitan provided a review of the water year 2022 along with the current emergency water conservation program for the state water project dependent areas with their water supply planning efforts into 2023. And currently, Metropolitan is projecting their end of dry year storage to be 2.2 million acre feet, However, those supplies shown in the dry year storage portfolio may not be available throughout Metropolitan's entire service area. And more than half of the total storage that they indicate, that would come from their Colorado River supplies. So for planning efforts, much of the storage in Lake Mead may need to be held back in order to satisfy drought contingency plan contributions, which Metropolitan would be on. The three major water supply problems are currently impacting supplies to Metropolitan for calendar year 2023. And that includes an acute shortage of supply to meet demand in the state water project dependent areas, continued deteriorating conditions from the Colorado River supply, and downward trend of in-region storage reserves. So Metropolitan, their staff will continue working with member agencies within the state water project dependent areas on the parameters to continue the emergency program in 2023. And also Metropolitan is anticipating a potential water supply allocation approach for all member agencies across their entire service area. The Metropolitan staff had continued to collaborate with the Colorado River Basin states and California agencies to develop a plan that can further reduce water demand on the Colorado River. And these efforts may include additional conservation and other activities in an effort to leave more water in Lake Mead. So with respect to board meeting actions, attached are exhibits that include the results of the meeting in October, and then the summary of the vote, and then a draft list of the November items. And then with respect to a look ahead of the agenda item for Metropolitan, their November meeting took place last week, and the new board secretary was selected. That would be Director Lois Fong Sakai, representing the San Diego County Water Authority. She was elected to serve as a new board secretary, and her term will begin January 1st, 2023 for a 2-year period. And then the report on the budget expenditure trend has been deferred. So next month in December, they are looking to talk about the update on the climate action plan implementation and authorization of Colorado River Protection Volume Agreement. And then in January, they're looking to report on the Delta Conveyance Project follow-up workshop and an update on the acceleration of the Pure Water Southern California program. And then lastly, for the water supply update, included in this memo, the report starts on page 29, is a graphic that was prepared by Metropolitan. It summarizes the last water year, which ended September 2022. And the first page on that graphic shows the significant activity in the Northern California storage area in and around Lake Oroville. Well, the State Water Project last year began with a record rainfall, followed by a record-breaking dryness. And historical State Water Project allocation of back-to-back years with only 5% allocation for the contractors. And then on the second page indicates the activity along the Colorado River watershed. And on the bottom left side of the page shows the capacity levels at both Lake Powell and Lake Mead as a comparison from the start of the water year in October 2021 to the end of the water year in September 2022. And for example, Lake Mead lost 1.5 million acre feet of supply over the course of the year and ended up with 24% capacity. Lake Mead has 7.3 million acre feet of supplies at the start of the year and ended the year at 5.8 million acre feet. And then for Lake Powell, similarly, they lost 1.7 million acre feet throughout the course of the year and ended up with 28% capacity. Lake Powell had 9 million acre feet of supply at the start of the year and ended the year with 7.3 million acre feet. And looking at the chart at the bottom right corner is a shortage surplus outlook for Lake Mead. And this chart indicates another shortage at Lake Mead for next year. And looking ahead, if the shortage continues, Metropolitan would be required to contribute supplies beginning 2024 through 2026. So with October starting off with the new water year so far, we've seen conditions with rain and snow. And last week's early season storm did bring much needed rain, which has helped to provide some relief to the drought conditions that we've had along the state. But that concludes this report. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Hello? Yeah. Tammy?
Yes,
Thank you, Tammy.
thank you.
Are there any questions?
Well, thank you.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. This is Board Member Houston, and I may be able to only stay for part of the next item. Thank you.
Tammy, go on, please.
I think that concludes Tammy's report. And I'll just say,
Okay.
you know, the report regarding the conditions on the Colorado River just further emphasizes the actions that we are taking and should continue to take, which is, you know, promoting the removal of turf in our service area and the usage of the rebate programs that are adequately funded. Thank you to the board for increasing the budget, I think by 300,000 this fiscal year. And so keeping our pedal to the metal in that front. And then also continuing to press forward with our water retail agencies in partnership with the Water Replenishment District to do what's possible to incentivize increased groundwater production, reduced usage of imported supply on the Colorado River. In addition to that, you know, we have continued work with Metropolitan Water District and the City of Los Angeles on the future of our water recycling program. And that certainly is a very urgent program, but it won't happen overnight. But I'm happy to say that we are meeting as a group to Thursday on the 17th, being hosted by Metropolitan to further collaborative talks and discussions between multiple agencies. Thank you, Tammy, for sharing all of the Metropolitan updates, and in particular, the conditions on the Colorado River and the state aqueduct.
Tammy, thanks again for your always thorough report. So thank you very much. So can we go to the next item?
Absolutely. So that takes us to the last item on the information calendar, Director Gray, which is the diversity, equity, and inclusion policy discussion. And this particular item was added to the agenda in response to the discussions that occurred last month here in the committee as it related to a certain contract that we were looking to authorize in support of the IRWIMP, the Integrated Regional Water Management Plan. And so with that, the committee wanted to talk more broadly about diversity, equity, inclusion, and how that happens, you know, in all that we do as a district. And so with that, to kind of launch the conversation here today, I did invite a friend and colleague from LA Department of Water and Power, Mr. Ty Washington, to provide a quick update on the DEI, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Framework toolkit that he jointly worked on with other colleagues in the, I believe it's in the CUA Association, California Urban Water Users Association. And so with that, let me just give a real quick introduction for my friend Ty Washington. He's an executive assistant general manager on workforce diversity with LADWP and has served in this role since 2020. And as an executive AGM, Ty's role encompasses hiring, recruitment, retention, services, employment, development, and mentorship. His focus also includes LADWP's diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, targeting workforce development, economic development, and community engagement, as well as supplier diversity. Ty has helped create non-traditional recruiting and trades training for underserved LA residents and provide solution-oriented guidance and recommendations to the general manager and chief engineer of LADWP Mr. Marty Adams. Ty's role provides the opportunity to coordinate with elected officials, other city department leadership, and community stakeholders. Ty has also served as a liaison to the Historically Black College and University, the HBCU Recruitment Committee within the city of Los Angeles. And as mentioned a moment ago, he also works with the California Urban Water Association and their Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, where this toolkit that he will talk about was developed and is now a part of that committee's library of resources. So with that, let me ask Ty to go ahead and take the floor while I share my screen to display the short presentation that Ty has.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you, Chairwoman Gray, as well as the other directors. I appreciate you having me this afternoon. So today, I'm not only representing LADWP, but I am representing CUA, California Urban Water Agencies. And so, Greg, can we go to the first slide? Go to the next slide. Yeah, okay. So just for understanding, CUA collectively serves about 2/3 of the state's population, established in 1990. The organization develops technical information on California water to help inform policy. And so the member agencies' resources are pooled to study water management issues, develop consensus solutions among the urban water community, and engage with California water leadership as well. Go ahead, next slide. And so here are some of the learning objectives that were outlined in the beginning when we created the DEI toolkit for CUA. We wanted to recognize some best practices for implementing DEI programs. We wanted to identify approaches to remain accountable by periodically assessing progress, identifying gaps, and prioritizing improvements that lead to DEI within an organization. And lastly, acknowledging common challenges with implementing those programs. It's certainly not easy to do so, and every organization is different, and where they are and how they start is all different. So there is not one size fits all. I've said this for the longest time, and certainly this applies in this case. Next slide. Go ahead, next slide. Okay, so here are just the definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion. I just felt like it was important to illustrate this so that organizations and individuals within those organizations can truly understand the differentiating factors between them. And so I certainly won't read them, but it's important as you are, excuse me, as you're proceeding down this path to better understand what DEI means, and then apply what those definitions mean to you in said organization. Next slide. So this is the development process of how CUA came about working on a strategic toolkit and wanting to have something that was universal that we could share, not just within our own organizations, but also with other agencies at large, regardless of whether or not you were a member or not. So the DEI toolkit is an outcome of CUA's aspiration to embody DEI through its culture, practices, and accountability. While a common critique of DEI program implementations is that efforts are more oftentimes than not viewed as reactionary, the activities that, excuse me, that led to development of the DEI toolkit reflect an intentional decision based on alignment with strategic aspirations, direction provided by our board, and guidance provided by the DEI committee. The activities that led to the development of the toolkit reflect transparency, and we want to be able to make sure that we're providing the best practices that embody what DEI means. Next slide. And so I want to start clockwise with this. These are, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So starting clockwise, creating an inclusive work environment where all employees feel welcome and comfortable, right? Psychologically safe, right? Sharing diverse ideas, sharing approaches and other perspectives, both within our own agencies as well as our member agencies, and making sure that it reflects and supports the diversity of the communities that we represent and that we serve. We want to ensure our work benefits all communities by promoting environmental justice, including an accessible and affordable water supply, environmental restoration, and land use and watershed stewardship projects to mitigate the impacts of climate change, such as providing equitable flood protection. Going in a clockwise motion, increasing diversity, representation, inclusion, and a sense of belonging at all levels, whether it's on the board, leadership, professional, or the trade levels. And lastly, is remaining accountable by periodically assessing programs, assessing our progress, identifying gaps, and prioritizing improvements that lead to DEI initiatives and goals. And so I think it's important, like these are like the four main pillars for what we want to do for DEI. Certainly when I speak with DWP, these are aspects that we definitely applied when we did our own racial equity action plan. And we're still doing them and still utilizing these same principles as we're continuing on with our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion within the department. Go ahead to the next slide, Greg. And you can actually skip this one, Greg, because this was like a continuation of the other one. And so what do we all here to see? Thanks, Greg, about this toolkit. So reading off my notes, CUA agencies saw the value in sharing ideas and progress with each other as each agency was embarking on a unique DEI journey. So when you go to the website, if you choose to go, you can see a repository and a great collection of a lot of racial equity action plans, not just from DWP, but from other organizations that really kind of embodied what different organizations were feeling at the time. What it truly meant for those organizations at that time, whether it was aspects related to workforce development, or it was aspects related to economic development, aspects related to supplier diversity, or whatnot, whether it was in combination with their respective labor unions and labor groups, or whether it was conversations that they had with their own higher ups or their own board. It really is a great repository of information that's on that website. And I really think it's important that as everyone who's ever listening to this should go ahead and take a look and see beyond just what the toolkit is, kind of go ahead and take a look at to see what everyone else is doing. I really feel it's great because a lot of these different reports, maybe these are things that maybe whether West Basin or other organizations can pull from, and maybe it's not going to be a one size fits all situation. There are certainly aspects related to each and every organization's report that maybe you can pull from and utilize that best fits yours. So the toolkit as a whole is designed to compile these resources and examples and summarize these best practices from our agencies and our shared lessons. And so the toolkit is a living, breathing, dynamic document with resources that are going to be updated as more information and examples become available. So next slide. So three major aspects to the three major pillars to CUA's toolkit are the executive management commitment, data assessment, and then the action plan. Excessive management commitments can necessitate the development of a data assessment. Results from a data assessment inform the development of the action plans, and associated recommendations often result in refined executive management commitments. So it's an iterative process as each element can be updated and refined to reflect new information and progress. So improving DEI in organizations is a dynamic process, and it just frankly requires a long-term commitment from organizations, balancing the desire for rapid progress with the creation of solid foundation for long-term change. So when I tell people that if you're going to go through this process, most important thing you want to do is, do you have the time? have you given yourself the time? Not just to like actually create something, but what's your short-term, long-term goals that you want to actually apply? And then how can these aspects of DEI fit into real transformative change within the organization? DWP, for instance, for us, we actually want, to his credit, Marty Adams, our general manager and chief engineer, as well as our board president, Cynthia McLean Hill, checking the box wasn't good enough when it came to DEI. And so they made it a heavy part of the organization. So DEI manages HR, manages supplier diversity, manages a analytical research and development team called Equity Metrics. They manage it, they run it. And anyone that knows in a government run organization, if you don't run something, then you're not really in control of it. And so I think that was something that they wanted to make a very important, powerful impact on. And they wanted to make sure that DEI was something that was going to not just be a check the box fashion, at least in their eyes. Was there any questions? Sorry, I was getting a little bit of feedback.
Are there any questions, board members?
Okay.
No
So
comment, no question, comment.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It sounds like you're definitely on the right track.
Okay. I was just I heard a little something, so I just wanted to stop really quickly. I'm about to bring it on home in a little bit. Greg, we can go to the next slide. Right. So just really quickly, we can just break down what each of these pillars are. We talked about that: executive management commitment, tangible action to advance DEI based on your stated mission, values, and your goals. That, of course, is based off of what your leadership wants to do. And this, again, these next slides, happy to, I can just run through these really quickly. Just kind of helps in terms of talking about each pillar that we just discussed about. So the executive management commitment, next slide, Greg. Data assessment, very important. Something that we talked a lot about. When we handle aspects related to data, what do you do with that information afterwards, right? Like, you now know that you have a goal and an edict that you want to move forward on, right? But now you want to get this information, and now what do you do with it? What you should do is then allow this data to inform how you move forward. A great opportunity I feel that a lot of people miss is that they collect this data, but then they just collect it and make charts, but then there's no action and plan that goes along with that. And so as I was helping, the other member agencies talk about this, that's why we wanted to be able to have like an iterative process that was kind of free flowing, right? Because a lot of times people get all this information, they get this data, but they don't really know what to do with it, or they don't know what the best course of action to move on that. And so one thing that I know that I talked a lot about is always taking a look at this data and seeing from, for instance, you can tell whether or not a program or an initiative that you're doing is impacted in a positive or negative manner by always constantly reviewing it and reviewing it at maybe right before your fiscal year and seeing whether or not that is this data that we've received. Are we putting enough resources behind this initiative or this program? Or should we pivot and maybe bob and weave and decide like, okay, maybe this isn't the right course of action. Maybe we should go and pivot and go another direction. It's important to be able to do that with the data that you're accessing. And for a lot of times, a lot of organizations, I've found that they've become very crippled with the accumulation of that data and not necessarily know what to do with it. But it's not mission impossible. It's just mission difficult. And that's how I tell people through this process. Greg, next slide. Of course, lastly is the action plan, right? Approaching to determine the scope of work and the feedback mechanisms for implementing your DEI initiatives. Focusing on 3 to 4 short-term priorities can help demonstrate near-term progress. I think that's a great opportunity for all of us to be able to do. I think a lot of people, when they say, okay, I want to do something in DEI, right? I want to do something meaningful and impactful, but I don't know where to start. Start small and then build your way up. I don't think that it's in anyone's best interest to take on too much and to promise too much starting off. I think you have to have a little bit of self-awareness of where you are as an organization. You also need to see financially, what can you do? What are you allowed to do? I'd say that to people because some people say, I want to do this, but maybe by their own governance, they're not allowed to. Maybe by their own board of directors, they're not allowed to do that. So you have to be able to have a little bit of self-awareness as you create your action plans. What can I do? What are my resources and what are my capabilities and what are the things that I'm allowed to do? And maybe things that maybe we should work towards. And maybe it's not necessarily putting a ton of money behind certain aspects. Maybe it's doing strategic partnerships with organizations that we can do over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. These are conversations that you should start having. So these are things that I think a lot of people also want to just throw a lot of money at things. And that's not necessarily a good thing either. Having a lot of money is great. Having a lot of resources is amazing. But using those resources and using that money strategically is far more important. So that's what I tell people. Next slide. Okay, next steps. So, so just your intentional outreach. Like, so what exactly is it that you can do? Your next steps after you've created this plan, and what is it that I can do? You can create an outreach plan with your communications team that includes going to conferences and talking to trade publications and going on podcasts and things of that nature. So doing an external relations plan, and then also going from a future expansion, looking at maybe hiring practices, right? That's a good example that I use to say, well, how can I apply these DEI principles into the day-to-day functions of what we do as an entity, whether from an internal perspective and an external perspective as well. I think that you want to have an internal outreach because you want to make sure people know that you are actively engaged in this process, but you're not just kind of going through the motions either. That's again why it's really important to make sure that your action plans are really grounded in items that you can actually accomplish and that are not so far-fetched. If you take a look at, I'll give you an example. When we were going through the process of the Racial Equity Action Plan, one of the suggestions was, you know what, we should just abolish the civil service system. That's what we should do. We should just move forward and just completely abolish the civil service system. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I love y'all. It's not going to happen. We need to be able to make sure that whatever goals, recommendations we put forward are tangible and are also realistic. So I think it's also make sure that it's important that as you're going through this process, you're having that as a grounded, like a sense of grounding is important as you move through this. Next slide, Greg. I've said before, much ton of more information on the 3 pillars of the KUA's DEI plan is on their website. I urge everyone to go through it. If you have time, I would very much have you look at other organizations' viewpoints on how they addressed this racial equity action plan, what other big organizations and how they viewed and how they submitted to their public and to their board of directors or to their committees on what DEI meant to them. It's really great. I think it's important, and I think it's imperative reading for anybody that's in this space. Because I think, again, you don't have to feel as if you have to take on everything, but you do want to be able. I don't think it's wrong for you to take a look at certain aspects related to what others have written and see how it could best. You can maybe pick and choose and take from those things to help best serve you in your respective organization. And I think having an action plan, like a shorter term, like a 1 to 2 year span, that kind of helps you do something from the short term perspective, and then thinking maybe from a strategic plan or from a longer vision, of maybe a 3 to 5 year span, that can help you be able to kind of guide you into the next, or at least be able to at least guide you, forward in how you want to be able to approach these issues, and not having you feel so overwhelmed and feeling like maybe I'm not doing enough, maybe we are not taking on more. It's just imperative to be able to have a short and long-term plan in that regard. So next slide, Greg. Yep, wrap up. And again, these were the main objectives that we took a look at, right? And I think that this is kind of what helped guide our principles in creating those 3 pillars in our toolkit. And I feel that we have really put a really good plan together for most individuals to be able to emulate. It's certainly something that I tell a lot of organizations that they should absolutely take a look at. And again, it helps you guide those principles in moving forward and what you as a respective organization can do and what you feel comfortable in doing so. So I think that's it. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak before all of you. And if there's any questions that you have, I'm here and happy to answer.
Thank you, Ty. I really appreciate your providing that overview of the KUA DEI toolkit and the framework there. And so I do want to kind of pivot towards a few of my own thoughts and remarks to support the conversation here. I know we're 20 minutes past our committee time, so if it pleases the chair for me to continue, I will.
Greg, I think we probably should ask the board if they have any questions of Mr. Washington. And thank you, Ty, very much for that presentation. I believe that's the same one you gave the Metropolitan, and I'm really pleased that LADWP has hired you to be their DEI person. And thank you so much for what you're doing on behalf of anyone who supports DEI. But are there any questions from the board members right now before Greg continues? Okay. Greg, would you go on, please?
Okay, absolutely. Thank you, Chair Gray. So first, I'd like to just provide a really quick acknowledgement of some of the past efforts that the district has done relative to DEI. And these are just probably just a glimpse of the DEI work that's been done, but let me just kind of count those real quick. So in August 2020, there was a survey of employees done, prepared in-house. And so that was completed in late 2020, early 2021. Unconscious bias training was provided by the American Leadership Foundation, who also prepared a report of their own observations based on discussions with staff through the training process. Subsequent to that, in 2021, a workforce diversity report was developed. And then the district formed a diversity, equity, inclusion committee also in 2021. And that committee continues to function to this day, led by our human resources manager, Michelle Green. I'll add kind of our recognition of Juneteenth as a district holiday as I think an important accomplishment relative to DEI as well. But again, these are just glimpses of some of the work that's been done. And certainly we can look more broadly at the entirety of the district's work as it relates to diversity and inclusivity in all that we do. And I think that really kind of brings home the reason why this was a question in the last meeting, is that we want to make sure that diversity, equity, inclusion is incorporated in everything that the district does. And so I thought today's report, our presentation by Ty Washington, would be a great springboard to talk about what we can continue to do to further our goals and objectives around DEI. And I think that the framework that the KUA toolkit offers, number one, executive commitment. Number two, data assessment. Number three, action plan. Those key ingredients illustrate, the support that senior and executive management, and I would say the board, has to prioritize and make diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility an important core value of the district. The data assessment piece is also a critical component of framework because we need to know what are the areas of concern that we need to improve upon. And without measuring the issues, then how can we really know that we're progressing if we don't have the data to back that up? And so I think Ty spoke very well about the importance of the data piece of the framework. And then, of course, the action plan, having some goals that we set out to accomplish and being very intentional about looking at the progress and maybe even course correction if we see that the results are less than satisfactory. So with that, I want to talk about what I think are the core target areas for West Basin. And I think the first area is looking internally at our staffing, so hiring, recruitment, promotions. How inclusive is that? How diverse are we as an organization internally? And then we can look externally, supplier diversity. We have so many companies that are supporting the district's work, both in terms of our contract operations with Veolia, Inframark, and then all the different services in terms of consulting and other companies who do business with West Basin. And how does that support our DEIA goals? And then the variety of services that we provide to our communities, how inclusive is that? Are we reaching everyone? Is the access to our programs equitable? Who benefits? Are there any disparities? And then workforce development, recognizing that we can contribute towards the water workforce of tomorrow. And so what is West Basin doing towards that end? And is it also providing maximizing the potential for a diverse workforce in the water industry? And so with that, I think that we certainly can embrace the framework that Ty talked about and work as a senior leadership team with the board and with our DEI committee. And I would even say broadly with staff to craft an approach towards DEI. Are there some quick wins that might be something that we can consider? I think so. And so in the area of executive commitment, I think that we can look at developing a statement of core values that incorporates DEIA as a district core value. And in so doing, we can also establish goals in our forthcoming strategic business plan. We have to develop the 2022 through 2028 business plan, and certainly DEIA should be a core value that is reflected in our strategic business plan. So I think that's a quick win that we can certainly go forward with. Also in the area of executive commitment is looking at the variety of policies and our allocation of resources to move DEI forward. And so I mentioned those core areas of hiring internally, supplier diversity, how our programs reach the communities, and even building the pipeline for tomorrow. And so how are our policies compatible with furthering DEI in each of those categories? And if we have any gaps, we as a leadership team can work towards improving our policies to ensure that we're as effective to maximize DEI results and outcomes in each of those core areas. And then also putting our money where our mouth is in terms of providing the resources necessary to actually be effective. Then the other thought that I have in terms of quick wins with executive commitment is making our efforts visible. And so I think we can certainly provide a routine periodic report to our board on our DEI goals, the data that we're collecting and reporting on, the progress that we're making on action plans and the results that we're seeing. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. If it's out of mind, it probably is not that important. In the 6 months that I've been here with the West Basin, I don't think our DEI committee has reported once to the board. And so I think, providing that visibility for our efforts is an important part of showing executive commitment. That's a quick win. So then, in the area of recruitment and hiring, in terms of quick win, I think we can certainly broaden our outreach to make sure that when we recruit, that we're reaching underrepresented communities to ensure that our workforce reflects the diversity of the communities that we serve. Now, the workforce report that was prepared in 2020 showed that we have a pretty good parity of our workforce with the overall larger community of the county. And so I think we're in good footing in terms of, you know, the diversity of the West Basin District. But then when you start to look at that in terms of the vertical aspects, in terms of, you know, staff level, management level, executive level, our report does not break that down. And that may be another form of recruitment and hiring that we need to look at to make sure that our practices are as diverse and inclusive as we aspire for them to be. On the area of organizational equity and inclusivity, we should refresh the 2020 survey. You know, how are staff feeling today compared to maybe what was indicated in the 2020 survey? Also supporting the DEI committee with resources in the goals that they would like to accomplish on behalf of the organization. So again, that kind of goes along the lines of putting our money where our mouth is and making sure that we support the people, the employees who are on the front line, moving our DEI initiatives forward. And then the last item that I have here is, yes.
Do you have one more item? Because I think there's only one other board member on the line, and you're giving a lot of information. So we really should schedule it where all the board members can hear what you have to say. I didn't realize that it was going to be.
It was
this
just
kind of
me here.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, you know, I know we're way over time now. We're at 3:00 now, and I apologize for that.
Yeah. We
I was
should have
getting
scheduled
special
it
treatment. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I certainly, you know, this is an area of importance for me for a lot of reasons. And so I really appreciate, you know, Director Gray, your specific interest, and Director Williams in raising these questions in the last committee meeting. And certainly I could continue on here. Let me just end by saying, and we perhaps can further this conversation in a future board meeting where all the board members are present.
Greg, what I suggest, first of all, you need to get input from the board because you need to make sure the board is giving you the kind of direction that you're talking about, right? So you really need the full board to be engaged in what you're saying. What I was going to suggest, and I don't know if that's what you're presenting, is really a plan, some kind of proposal to come back to the board, because I don't know if we have D&I goals. Does the board have any goals for D&I? Have we ever discussed that at all?
I think that that's an important question for us to answer collectively.
Yeah. Right.
And so I absolutely agree with what you're suggesting here.
You first have to make sure the board is on target with the goals that we have so that you can move forward with achieving those goals. So I think we need to have as many board members as possible to be part of the discussion. So maybe we need a workshop on D&I. It's an important subject, and I think we all believe that, and it's going to take some time to talk about it, I think. So we can maybe dedicate an hour to it as part of a meeting and have not a very long agenda. I don't know, but you and I can discuss that. I'm chair of water policy, and so you and I can make that and discuss how that should happen. But today
Absolutely.
I want to thank Ty Washington for his presentation today and for your comments, Greg, but I think we should save that for the board to be fully engaged, to hear what you have to say. But I think more important, you need to come back with some kind of, well, first we need to discuss what our goals are and what we believe we should be doing as a board as it relates to D&I.
Absolutely. That's very good feedback, Director, and direction. And so I think we'll conclude my remarks here, and then we'll talk about next steps so we could bring that back potentially to the next Water Policy Committee.
Great, thank you.
Okay,
All right,
thank you.
Sure, what's the next item on the agenda?
So I think that takes us to the closed session, which there aren't any closed session items. And after that, we have our director's comments and future agenda items.
All right, Director Williams, do you have any comments?
Why did you stop him? I was enjoying this and with special treatment. No, no, I
All
was
right,
surprised.
Dr. Williams.
Thank you.
All right, thank you to all the staff, everyone, general manager and all the staff, and Mr. Washington for you being here making your presentation. So I appreciate everyone's comments and participation today. So with that,
Okay.
agenda items, Greg, any future agenda items?
I think this is where you can provide additional remarks if you like, or additional agenda items. I think certainly throughout the meeting, there were several agenda items that were indicated, and so we will follow up on those.
Right.
And so I don't think we have anything else here unless you have anything more to add.
No, just what was brought out during the meeting. So thank you very much, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much for being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.